Alexandria swelters beneath a cloudless August sky, the air so thick with heat it feels like a physical weight pressing on stone and skin alike. The harbor shimmers, each ripple in the water reflecting the sunlight like a blade. War galleys lie anchored beyond the breakwater, their bronze rams glinting as if eager for work. Along the quay, Roman standards snap in the dry wind, the red and gold a constant reminder of power just outside the city's reach. Merchants pretend to haggle over fish and grain, but their eyes keep drifting toward the military ships that have appeared in greater numbers each day. Inside the palace, where fountains spill cool water into marble basins, Cleopatra stands at the edge of a colonnade, her hands resting lightly on the polished stone railing. The linen of her gown clings in the heat, gold collar fixed high at her throat, every detail of her appearance calculated for control. Below, the courtyards teem with movement, servants carrying sealed tablets, messengers on horseback disappearing into the streets, guards shifting at their posts. Octavian's envoys are in the city, waiting for an audience. Their arrival is no mere formality. It is a statement, a visible sign that the time for diplomacy is nearly over. In every corner of Alexandria, people talk in lowered voices, guessing which gates will open and which will be barricaded when the Roman legions arrive in force. Cleopatra watches the horizon beyond the pharaoh's lighthouse, where the pale blue of the Mediterranean hides the threat it carries. This war will not be fought only with ships and swords. It will be fought with loyalties, and she knows loyalties bend before they break. She remembers another summer, years before, when the sun seemed less threatening and the harbor was filled with the flags of allies rather than watchers. News of Julius Caesar's assassination had reached Alexandria in a single, breathless day, carried by traders and sailors whose faces told the story before their mouths formed the words. The great Roman who had restored her throne and recognized Caesarion as her son lay dead beneath the Senate's marble vault. She had known Rome's politics were dangerous, but the speed and cruelty of the killing still struck like a blow. Couriers who once wrote to her in confident, familiar tones began sending messages laced with uncertainty. Some avoided her entirely, letting weeks pass in silence. Others arrived with assurances that dissolved under scrutiny. In the council halls of Alexandria, senators spoke cautiously, as though Caesar's ghost might be listening, while privately wondering if her position could survive without his protection. Allies who had feasted with her now studied Egypt's resources like merchants eyeing a prize. And beneath all of this was the cold truth. The Senate did not care for Egypt's independence except as a lever to be used against its own rivals. Standing in the palace courtyard, she understood that Caesar's death left her exposed. There would be no more automatic recognition, no guarantees of Rome's favor. What she did next would define her reign, and perhaps her life. Already, her enemies whispered that her loyalty to Rome had been a facade, that she was prepared to betray them the moment it served her. The irony was sharp. In Rome, she was accused of undermining the Republic, but in Alexandria, she was whispered about as a pawn of Roman ambition. Betrayal, it seemed, was not defined by truth, but by who was telling the story. The council chamber in Alexandria was designed to impress. Towering columns of red granite, floors inlaid with patterns of lapis and ivory, open archways framing the distant shimmer of the sea. But on that day, it felt like a theater of distrust. Cleopatra sat at the head of the long cedar table, every eye on her as she read a letter from Mark Antony aloud. His words promised security, alliance, and mutual benefit, but in the chamber, the words landed with different weights. To the Egyptian elite, her relationship with Antony was a gamble that could drag the kingdom into Rome's civil wars. To the Roman Senate, Antony's devotion to Cleopatra was proof he had betrayed Rome for a foreign queen. Each gesture she made toward him, the fleets she sent, the grain she provided, the gold she shipped, was recorded in memory by men who would one day stand in judgment. Whispers slipped between courtiers. She had tied Egypt's fate to a man whose own loyalties were suspect. But what the whispers ignored was the calculation behind her choice. Antony controlled Rome's eastern territories, held the loyalty of legions, and had influence over the Senate's decisions. Aligning with him was not a romance in isolation. It was a strategy to secure Egypt's borders and independence. Yet strategy and perception rarely march in step. She could feel the tension in the room, see it in the quick glances exchanged between advisors. To them, her loyalty to Antony might one day be weighed against her loyalty to Egypt, and they would be the ones to decide which mattered more. Cleopatra knew that every alliance is a transaction, and every transaction demands a payment. The only question was when the bill would come due. In the streets, rumors flowed like water in the city's canals, twisting and spreading with every retelling. Along the bustling Canopic Way, where merchants displayed linen, glass, and spices from Nubia and India, whispers slipped from stall to stall. Their queen had sold Egypt's independence for love, for Mark Antony's favor. Dock workers unloading grain from barges argued over whether this alliance would bring prosperity or ruin, their voices dropping when a palace guard passed. In the perfumed courtyards of noble houses, the talk was sharper, more dangerous. Aristocrats who benefited from Rome's trade agreements feared that Antony's growing defiance toward Octavian would make Egypt a target. To them, Cleopatra was gambling with the stability of the entire Nile Valley. And yet, beyond politics, ordinary Alexandrians measured the queen's rule in loaves of bread and jars of oil. The markets remained stocked for now, but everyone knew that if war came, Rome could choke off Egypt's lifeline by sea. Along the wharves, fishermen repaired their nets while keeping one eye on the horizon, counting the masts of Roman ships that lingered beyond the harbor's mouth. Cleopatra was aware of every murmur, every sign of unease. Her spies moved quietly among the crowds, reporting the tone of the city as much as the words spoken. She understood that loyalty was fragile, especially when measured in stomachs and coin purses. If Octavian's fleet blocked Alexandria's ports, the poor would not rally to a queen's banner out of sentiment. They would follow the hand that fed them. That knowledge was both a weapon and a warning. She could not afford to lose the people's trust, but trust was a currency spent faster than it could be earned. Her meeting with Antony in Tarsus had been a masterpiece of spectacle and intention. She sailed up the Cydnus River on a barge draped with purple sails, the symbol of royalty and divine association. The deck was a stage set with gilded couches, silver goblets, and servants dressed as eros and nymphs, scattering rose petals into the air. The scent of cinnamon and incense carried on the breeze, reaching Antony before she did. His entrance onto the barge was theatrical in its own way. The seasoned general striding forward, laughing, extending his arms in welcome. They spoke of Egypt's wealth, Rome's rivalries, and the need to secure grain routes against piracy. Every word was calculated, every pause measured. Antony saw in her a partner who could provide resources and legitimacy in the East. Cleopatra saw in him the shield that could keep Octavian's ambitions at bay. But their alliance was more than politics. Publicly, it was celebrated in festivals, parades, and proclamations. Privately, it was sealed with intimacy that Rome's gossip would twist into scandal. She knew the risk, that tying Egypt's fate to a man so deeply enmeshed in Rome as civil wars could backfire. But risk was the language of survival. Every gift of ships or gold was a move in a game where hesitation was fatal. The challenge was that each gift also became evidence in the eyes of her critics. She was playing for Egypt's future, but the perception was that she played for her own desires. That perception would be harder to fight than any Roman legion. Back in Alexandria, her palace became a nest of shifting allegiances. Octavian, ever the strategist, began sending letters to Egyptian nobles, offering them safety, wealth, and continued influence if they abandoned their queen. Some of these messages were intercepted. Others were deliberately shown to Cleopatra by loyalists to prove their devotion. But for each intercepted letter, she knew there were more that had reached their targets without her knowledge. The most dangerous kind of betrayal was not the loud, defiant break, but the quiet withdrawal of support masked by smiles and formal bows. In court, the same faces she had known for years now seemed veiled, their loyalty difficult to read. One advisor, who had argued passionately for war the month before, now counseled delay and negotiation. Another suggested preparing terms of surrender, just in case. Cleopatra kept her voice calm, her expression controlled, but she cataloged each shift in tone, each hesitation. Betrayal could come from Rome, from Antony, or from within her own walls, and she had to be ready for all three. The palace guards, once chosen for their loyalty, were rotated more frequently now, their backgrounds checked twice. She knew that survival in this moment depended on anticipating the moment a man's self-interest outweighed his oath. Loyalty, she reflected, was not a permanent condition. It was a balance of fear, reward, and belief. Octavian was trying to tip that balance in his favor, and if she could feel it in her own court, she could be certain it was already happening in Alexandria's streets. The year turned and the war came closer. Octavian's fleets moved into Greek waters, their prows cutting through the Aegean like blades. Antony's preparations accelerated. He summoned allies from across the eastern provinces, though their responses were telling. Some arrived promptly with ships and soldiers. Others sent only token forces, their loyalty already diluted. Cleopatra ordered convoys of Egyptian grain to support Antony's armies, knowing that each shipment would be tracked by Octavian scouts. These convoys were both lifelines and targets. In Alexandria, the people began to notice the strain. Stores that had once overflowed were now carefully measured. Prices rose in the markets. Bread that had been affordable for the poorest was now a luxury for some. The same ships that were symbols of Egyptian strength in the harbor were also symbols of absence, resources leaving the city to fight a war most Alexandrians would never see. Cleopatra understood that the optics were dangerous. Her public appearances became more deliberate. She visited the markets, oversaw the distribution of grain, and ensured that her presence reminded people of the queen who still stood among them. But presence alone could not fill granaries. If Octavian tightened his grip on the seas, famine would become a reality, and famine was the fastest path to rebellion. Her war was no longer just with Rome. It was with the ticking clock of her own people's patience. Actium was supposed to be the decisive strike. Antony had the experience, Cleopatra had the ships, and together, they commanded a formidable force. Yet as dawn broke over the Ionian Sea, the battle unfolded into disaster. Roman fire ships darted among their lines, setting vessels ablaze. The smoke thickened, obscuring signals and sowing confusion. In the chaos, Cleopatra made the fateful decision to break through and escape. Her squadron cut a path southward, sails straining, oars churning white foam. Antony, seeing her retreat, made the split-second choice to follow. To Octavian and his propagandists, this was the proof they needed: a queen who fled the fight, and a Roman general who abandoned his men for her. The narrative was written before the last embers faded on the water. In Egypt, the news was met with shock and disbelief. The retreat was framed as cowardice by her enemies and as treachery by some of her own. She knew the decision had been tactical, survival to fight another day. But in politics, perception could be more lethal than defeat itself. Actium became a story told in Rome's terms, and no amount of Egyptian explanation could unmake it. The word betrayal took root, a seed that would grow in the mouths of her critics until it was indistinguishable from truth. The retreat to Alexandria was a march into uncertainty. The city braced for siege, the harbors fortified, and the outer gates reinforced. Inside the palace, Antony's mood shifted from defiance to silence, his once loyal officers slipping away in small groups under the cover of night. Each defection was a wound, not just to military strength, but to morale. Cleopatra kept her own counsel, focusing on what could be controlled: the supply lines, the loyalty of the guard, and the defenses within the palace district. Yet she could feel the city's mood souring. Alexandria was proud, but it was also pragmatic. The people would not fight to the last stone if they believed surrender could spare their lives. Each empty chair in the council chamber was a reminder that loyalty was being traded for survival. Her challenge was to keep enough hands on the wheel to steer through the coming storm. Antony's bitterness deepened, his trust eroded by rumors and losses. They were partners still, but each sensed the distance growing between them. In war, as in politics, isolation could kill faster than the enemy's sword. Cleopatra refused to be isolated. She made sure her presence was felt, in the council, in the markets, in the streets, even as the circle around her grew smaller. Octavian's forces finally appeared at Alexandria's gates, their banners visible from the palace rooftop. The legions camped within sight of the pharaoh's lighthouse, their siege line stretching like a noose. The harbor was sealed, cutting off escape by sea. Cleopatra summoned her treasurers and ordered the fleet prepared for a final, desperate breakout. But the plan unraveled before it began. A trusted scribe, a man who had served her for years, passed word of her intentions to the Romans. By the time her orders reached the docks, Octavian's ships had repositioned, ready to intercept. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any from her enemies because it came from within her own circle. She dismissed the scribe quietly, avoiding the spectacle of public punishment. Rage would serve no purpose now. The damage was done. Instead, she shifted her focus to holding the city for as long as possible, buying time for negotiations that might preserve something for her children. The escape had been her best chance to keep options open. Now, with the harbor sealed and the Romans tightening their grip, the choices narrowed to two: surrender or die. For Cleopatra, neither option was acceptable without one final attempt to shape her own fate. Antony was not a man to forgive suspicion. When word reached him, through whispers in corridors and the sly confidence of supposed friends, that Cleopatra had opened private channels to Octavian, his reaction was immediate and sharp. To him, the very notion that she might negotiate behind his back was nothing less than treachery. The truth was more complex. Cleopatra had indeed sent discreet messages, but they were driven by calculation, not betrayal. She sought terms that might secure her children's future and preserve some shred of Egypt's autonomy. In her mind, this was the duty of a queen whose nation was cornered. To Antony, a soldier who had built his life on loyalty and the bonds of command, it was a knife between the ribs. Their arguments no longer happened behind closed doors. They flared in the presence of attendants, in council meetings, even during the rare moments they still spent alone. Antony accused her of abandoning him. She countered that he had already abandoned Egypt by tying their fortunes so completely to battles Rome had no intention of letting them win. The space between them grew wider with every exchange. Yet despite the rift, they still needed each other. Antony's troops, though dwindling, remained the backbone of Alexandria's defenses. Cleopatra's resources still sustained what was left of his army. They were bound together by necessity, even as trust leaked away like water through cracked stone. Every day the Romans advanced their siege lines, and every day the tension inside the palace mounted. For Cleopatra, the personal fracture with Antony was painful, but the greater wound was strategic. Divided leadership would hasten Egypt's fall. She knew it, and so did Octavian, who would exploit it mercilessly. The collapse of Antony's forces came in increments, each more damaging than the last. One of his senior generals, a man Cleopatra had dined with many times, opened one of Alexandria's gates to Octavian's troops under the pretense of avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. The betrayal was dressed in the language of mercy, but Cleopatra recognized it for what it was, a calculated move to preserve the general's standing under Roman rule. The entry was limited, a foothold rather than an immediate occupation, but its psychological effect was devastating. The people of Alexandria, already wary, saw it as a sign that resistance was futile. Antony's remaining officers were rattled, questioning who among them might be the next to defect. Cleopatra convened her council that night, the torches casting long shadows on the walls as each advisor spoke. Some urged immediate surrender to spare the city. Others argued for holding out in hopes of an unlikely reversal. Cleopatra listened without revealing her decision. In truth, she had no illusions about the outcome. Octavian would have his victory. The only question was whether she could shape its terms. But to show hesitation now would only accelerate the erosion of loyalty. She issued orders to reinforce the palace district, secure food supplies, and keep watch on every man with the authority to command soldiers. In war, the enemy outside the walls was often less dangerous than the one within. As the night wore on, Cleopatra walked the palace corridors alone, the sound of her sandals echoing off stone. She had fought for years to keep Egypt independent, and now the walls of her own capital were closing in. The palace, once a place of open courtyards and sunlit halls, now felt like a fortress under siege. Octavian's messages arrived regularly, carried by envoys whose polite language barely veiled the threat beneath. He promised Cleopatra her life if she surrendered willingly, along with the assurance that she would be treated with the dignity befitting her station. She knew what this meant. She would be paraded through Rome as a living trophy, her humiliation serving as a warning to any ruler who defied Roman authority. In private, she asked her most trusted attendants to confirm what she already suspected. Octavian had no intention of allowing her to remain on Egypt's throne, not even as a figurehead. The reality was stark. Her reign was over, and the only choice left was how it would end. She considered her children constantly, weighing how her actions would shape their fates. Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, was the most vulnerable. Rome would see him as a threat to Octavian's claim, and threats in Rome did not live long. For her daughters, marriage into Roman noble families might offer safety, but at the cost of their freedom and identity. Each decision she faced was laced with the knowledge that every concession she made would be permanent. The more she thought of Rome's plans, the more she recognized that survival, for her, was not the same as living. A queen stripped of her power and paraded in chains was worse than dead. It was a betrayal of her people, her lineage, and herself. Her final meeting with Antony was a scene heavy with the weight of their shared history. He arrived looking thinner, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion and loss. The city's decline was etched into his face, every defection, every defeat leaving its mark. They spoke quietly at first, their words guarded, as though any moment might tip into another confrontation. Antony accused her again of plotting with Octavian. She denied it outright, though in her heart she knew he would never fully believe her. The truth was irrelevant now. Perception had already hardened into fact in his mind. She reminded him of their victories, their plans, the reasons they had allied in the first place. He spoke instead of the men who had deserted, the ships that had been lost, the inevitability of Rome's victory. The air between them was thick with unspoken grief, not just for their failing cause, but for the bond they had once shared. When the conversation ended, it was without resolution. Antony left her chambers without the formalities they had once observed. She watched him go, knowing it might be the last time she saw him alive. Later that day, when a false report of her death reached him, Antony's despair drove him to fall on his own sword. The blade did not kill him immediately. His aides, in panic, carried him back to the palace, where Cleopatra received him. He died in her arms. Their eyes locked in a final exchange neither could put into words. The death of Antony left Cleopatra surrounded but utterly alone. Outside the palace, Octavian's banners rose over Alexandria, a signal to the city that resistance had ended. Inside, the atmosphere was one of stunned silence. Antony's remaining loyalists mourned in private, but there was no time for prolonged grief. Cleopatra ordered Antony's burial rites to be carried out with dignity, ensuring his body would not be desecrated. She herself took no food, retreating to her private chambers to think. The death of her ally, and in many ways the last barrier between her and Octavian, forced her to confront the inevitability of her situation. She still had her children to consider, her legacy, and the dignity of her final moments. That night, she called in her most trusted servants and gave instructions for the care of her children should the worst happen. She arranged for the preservation of certain treasures and documents, ensuring that parts of Egypt's history and wealth would survive Roman rule. In these final acts, she reclaimed some measure of control. Though Octavian might take her throne and her life, he would not dictate every detail of her end. Her attendants noticed the change in her demeanor, the calm focus of a ruler who had made her choice. Even as Octavian prepared to enter the palace, Cleopatra's mind was already on the last act she would perform, one that would deny Rome the satisfaction it so clearly craved. Octavian entered the palace the following day, flanked by his officers. His manner was calculated, respectful enough to maintain the appearance of civility, yet firm in the knowledge that he was now master of Egypt. He greeted Cleopatra with measured politeness, praising her beauty, her intellect, her legacy, all while making it clear that her reign was finished. He offered her life on the condition that she submit to being taken to Rome. She listened without interrupting, her face a mask of composure. When he mentioned Caesarion, his tone shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, and she understood the unspoken truth. Her son would not be allowed to live. She asked for guarantees regarding the safety of her daughters, and Octavian assured her they would be treated with honor. She knew this meant they would be used as pawns in Rome's political games. The meeting ended with no formal agreement, but the balance of power was unmistakable. Octavian left satisfied that she was resigned to her fate. Cleopatra, however, had already decided otherwise. To go to Rome in chains was unthinkable. She would not be paraded before the same senators who had murdered Caesar, nor would she let her death be a spectacle under Octavian's control. In the hours after Octavian's departure, Cleopatra moved quickly. She ordered a bath, perfumed with rose and myrrh, and dressed in the royal linen and gold that marked her station. Her attendants, Eris and Charmian, understood without being told what this meant. The three women shared wine and spoke in low voices, recalling moments from earlier years, the great festivals, the voyages along the Nile, the victories in foreign lands. A servant brought in a basket of figs, a common gift for the queen. Beneath the fruit, coiled and silent, was the asp. Cleopatra regarded the serpent with calm acceptance. She had always known that her reign might end like this, not in the clamor of battle, but in a quiet room, surrounded by those she trusted most. She took the asp in her hands, feeling the cold smoothness of its scales. As she pressed it to her skin, the bite came quickly, a sharp pain that faded almost instantly. The venom moved fast, and Cleopatra reclined among her cushions, her breathing slowing. Iris and Charmian followed her into death, sealing the chamber from the inside. Outside, the palace moved on, unaware that the queen's final act had already denied Rome its triumph. By the time Octavian's men forced their way into the chamber, it was over. Cleopatra lay as though sleeping, the asp still at her side. The sight stilled even hardened soldiers, for in death she had preserved the dignity Rome had sought to strip away. Octavian was informed immediately. He ordered that she be buried with honor beside Antony, a gesture meant to display magnanimity, but also to close the chapter on her life without the spectacle she had denied him. The news spread quickly through Alexandria. The queen was dead. Some mourned openly, others in silence. For many, her death marked the end not just of her reign, but of Egypt's independence. In the days that followed, Octavian consolidated his control, placing loyal administrators in positions of power and reorganizing the province to serve Rome's needs. Yet the memory of Cleopatra lingered, a mixture of admiration, resentment, and sorrow. She had been a ruler who inspired fierce loyalty and equally fierce opposition, and in the end, she had chosen her own exit. The immediate aftermath saw Egypt transformed into a Roman province. The temples continued their rituals, but now they paid tribute directly to Rome. The grain fleet sailed north under the watch of Roman officers, their holds filled to feed a city far from the Nile's banks. In Alexandria, the streets adjusted to the presence of foreign soldiers, their armor glinting in the sun as they patrolled markets and docks. Statues of Cleopatra remained for a time, though her image on coins was quickly replaced with Octavian's. Among the people, her memory became a subject of quiet conversation. Some called her reckless for binding Egypt's fate to Antony. Others saw her as a patriot who had fought to preserve her kingdom in the face of overwhelming odds. The truth was more complicated, as truths often are. She had been both a shrewd political operator and a woman shaped by the dangerous currents of her time. For the generations that followed, Cleopatra's reign became a lens through which to understand the balance between ambition and survival, love and strategy, loyalty and betrayal. Centuries later, her story would still be told, in Rome, in Egypt, and far beyond. Historians would debate her motives, dramatists would embellish her choices, and poets would immortalize her beauty and cunning. But in Alexandria, where the stones of the palace still felt the heat of the same sun that had shone on her final days, the memory was more intimate. She was the queen who walked among her people during famine, who matched Rome in wit and will, and who chose her own end rather than suffer the indignity of conquest. Standing again at the palace balcony, as in the days before the siege, one could look to the horizon and imagine her gaze fixed on the same point where sea met sky. The question of betrayal, whether she betrayed Antony, Egypt, or herself, remains unanswered, for it depends on where one stands in the telling. Perhaps that is her greatest legacy, a life so complex that it resists any single judgment. If you enjoyed this, I am going to be posting a lot here. I would greatly appreciate it if you could subscribe. That is a wrap from Empire's History Tales. Glad you stopped by. See you next time.